This 1859 portrait of a plantation child appears innocent until you see the line in the dust. It looked like a simple family photograph at first, a sweet moment captured on a summer porch. But Dr. Rebecca Hartwell could not stop staring at the floor. She had been cataloging the Winslow estate collection for 3 months now, working methodically through boxes of daguerreotypes and ambrotypes donated to the Mississippi Historical Archive in Jackson. Most showed exactly what you would expect from prosperous Natchez families before the war: stiff poses, formal dress, carefully arranged furniture to signal wealth. This image seemed no different. A white toddler, perhaps 3 years old, sat on a wooden step clutching a porcelain doll. Her dress was pristine white cotton with lace trim. Beside her stood another child, a black girl who appeared to be around 10 or 11, holding a palm leaf fan. The fan was positioned just so, angled to provide shade without blocking the camera's view of the white child's face. Rebecca adjusted the LED magnifier and leaned closer. She had seen hundreds of photographs like this. The composition was standard: wealthy white child at the center, enslaved child as accessory, both performing their assigned roles for the camera. But something about the floor kept pulling her attention back. There, in the dust and dirt of the unpainted porch boards, was a line. Not a scratch in the wood itself, but a marking in the accumulated grime. It curved in a perfect arc, roughly 3 feet in radius, centered on the black girl's feet. The line was darker than the surrounding dust, as if something had been dragging through it repeatedly, wearing a groove into the layer of dirt. The arc continued almost completely around the girl's position, stopping only where the porch step interrupted it. Rebecca sat back in her chair. 14 years as a curator of antebellum Southern material culture, and she had never seen this particular detail before. She photographed the image with her phone, zoomed in, and photographed it again. That was when she noticed the second detail: the black girl's ankles. Even through the blur of 1859 photographic technology, there was a slight discoloration visible on both legs, just above where her bare feet pressed against the porch boards. The skin looked darker there, rougher, and her posture, which Rebecca had initially read as simply standing at attention, now looked different. The girl's weight was shifted slightly backward, as if she were used to something pulling forward on her legs. Rebecca pulled out the envelope that had contained the photograph. On the back, in careful cursive, someone had written, "Louisa Catherine Winslow, age 3, with her nursery girl Sarah, summer 1859, Winslow Hall, Natchez." This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was very wrong. Rebecca had spent her entire career learning to read what photographs tried to hide. She had started in this field after completing her dissertation on material culture and memory in slaveholding households, and every year the work became more urgent. Archives across the South were finally beginning to reckon with how their collections had been curated to tell only certain stories, to present plantation life as genteel and paternalistic rather than brutal and extractive. But that reckoning required people willing to look closely, to ask uncomfortable questions about images that had been displayed for generations as charming glimpses of the Old South. She had learned to spot the small things. The way enslaved people were positioned at the edges of frames, often slightly out of focus, as if the camera itself was trained to see them as background. The expressions that seemed blank, but on closer inspection revealed something harder to name: exhaustion, wariness, controlled rage. The objects that appeared in frame by accident, things the photographer had not quite managed to remove or hide. This line in the dust was something else. It was evidence that had almost been erased, but not quite. Rebecca carefully removed the photograph from its archival sleeve using cotton gloves. The image was an ambrotype, glass-backed and remarkably well preserved. She held it up to the light and examined the edges. There, pressed into the bottom corner of the glass plate, was a small stamp: J.D. Matthews, photographic artist, Natchez. She recognized the name. Matthews had been one of the more successful photographers in the city during the 1850s, with a studio on Main Street that catered to the wealthiest families. On the back of the glass, someone had etched a number, W47. That would be the Winslow family's internal cataloging system, suggesting this was the 47th photograph in their collection. That meant the family had been serious about documenting their lives, creating a visual archive of their wealth and status. Rebecca turned the photograph over again and studied the two children. Little Louisa Catherine looked directly at the camera, her face solemn in that way children's faces always were in early photographs when they had to hold still for long exposures. Her doll was positioned in her lap with care. Everything about her spoke of being treasured, protected, central. Sarah's face was harder to read. She was not looking at the camera but past it, her gaze directed somewhere to the left of the frame. Her expression was carefully neutral. The fan in her hands was held at exactly the right angle. Her dress was plain, undyed cotton, and her feet were bare. She stood within that curved line in the dust. Rebecca felt the weight of it settle in her chest, that familiar combination of dread and responsibility. If she ignored this, the photograph would go into the archive with its original caption, and that caption would continue to shape how people understood this moment. Louisa Catherine Winslow, age 3, with her nursery girl Sarah. As if Sarah's only identity was her function, as if the relationship between these two children was natural and affectionate rather than coerced. She could not let that happen. She opened her laptop and began to search. The Winslow family was easy to trace. They had been one of the wealthiest planting families in Adams County, with holdings that included over 400 enslaved people across multiple properties by the late 1850s. James Winslow, the patriarch who would have been Louisa Catherine's father or grandfather, had served in the Mississippi state legislature and was known for his vocal defense of slavery as a positive good. His obituary, published in the Natchez Daily Courier in 1867, described him as a pillar of the community and a generous patron of the arts. The family had maintained Winslow Hall, their main residence in Natchez, till the 1920s. The house still stood, actually, though it was now a bed and breakfast called the Magnolia Inn. Rebecca made a note to contact them. She pulled up the 1860 census and found the Winslow household, James Winslow, age 58, his wife Margaret, age 52, their daughter Elizabeth, age 24, and there, Louisa Catherine Winslow, age 4. The census also included a separate schedule for enslaved people, listed without names, only ages and genders. There were 37 enslaved people living at Winslow Hall itself, with many more on the outlying plantations. Among them, a black female, age 11, and another, age 4. Rebecca stared at that entry. Whoever had transcribed the census had noted in the margin, household servants. That would have included Sarah. She found a phone number for Dr. Marcus Chen, a historian at the University of Mississippi who specialized in slavery and childhood in the antebellum South. They had met at a conference 2 years earlier, and he had impressed her with his careful, unflinching work on how enslaved children were used within white households. "Rebecca," he said when he answered, his voice warm. "It's been too long. What are you working on?" She described the photograph and the line in the dust. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Tell me about the ages again," Marcus said. "The white child is 3. And the enslaved girl is maybe 10 or 11? That's what it looks like. And you said the line suggests something was pulling on her ankles, creating that arc pattern?" "Yes. Like she was moving back and forth but couldn't go beyond a certain radius." Marcus exhaled slowly. "I think you found evidence of nursery tethering. I've read about it in a few slave narratives, but I've never seen it captured in a photograph before, at least not this clearly." Rebecca felt her stomach turn. "Explain it to me." "In some of the wealthiest households," Marcus said, enslaved children were assigned to white infants and toddlers as constant companions. The white family would call them playmates or nursery helpers, but the reality was much darker. These children, usually girls, were tethered close to the white child they were meant to serve. Sometimes it was a rope around the waist. Sometimes it was an ankle restraint attached to a stake or a weight. The idea was that the enslaved child could never leave the white child unattended. They would sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. They would be within arm's reach at all times. "And the tether would create a worn path," Rebecca said quietly. "Exactly. The child would move within her radius, back and forth, day after day. Over time, that movement would leave traces, on floors, in dirt, in grass worn down to bare earth." He paused. The practice was most common in the Deep South among the planter aristocracy. Natchez would fit that profile exactly. Rebecca looked at the photograph again, that perfect arc, Sarah's worn ankles, the way she stood, weight shifted back. Why would they remove the tether for the photograph, she asked. Because these photographs were performances, Marcus said. They were meant to show the household as genteel, benevolent, civilized. The White family wanted to present themselves as caring masters who treated their slaves with kindness. They wanted to create visual evidence that slavery was a domestic institution, not a violent one. So yes, they would absolutely remove any visible restraints before calling in the photographer, but they could not erase the traces left behind. The line in the dust, Rebecca said. The line in the dust, Marcus agreed. That's the truth the photograph tried to hide but could not quite manage to erase. They talked for another hour. Marcus sent her a list of slave narratives that mentioned nursery tethering, including testimony collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s from formerly enslaved people who remembered the practice from their own childhoods or from stories told by their elders. One narrative, from a woman who had been interviewed in Arkansas, described being tied to a white baby's cradle with a rope around her waist, forbidden to move more than a few feet away even at night. Rebecca also found references in plantation records, though they were coded in the language slaveholders used to make their violence sound reasonable. Account books mentioned purchases of nursery restraints and child tethers. Letters between plantation mistresses discussed the management of nursery slaves, with advice on how to ensure constant attendance without visible marks. What emerged was a system that had been hiding in plain sight. Wealthy white families had presented these relationships as natural affection between children, and that narrative had persisted in historical memory. But the reality was a form of captivity specifically designed for children. Enslaved girls, some as young as 6 or 7, were bound to white infants and toddlers, forced to provide constant service, denied any freedom of movement. They were living toys, breathing furniture, always available. And when the photographer came to document the household's respectability, the restraints were removed just long enough to create an image that could be displayed, admired, passed down through generations as evidence of a gentler time. Rebecca contacted the Magnolia Inn. The current owner, a woman named Patricia Dawson, was surprised to hear from the archive. "The Winslow family?" Patricia said. "Oh yes, we have some of their things still. Old furniture, portraits on the walls, letters and documents in storage. The family sold the house in 1924, but a lot of the contents stayed. We've tried to preserve the historical character." "I'm working on a photograph from 1859, Rebecca explained. 2 children on the front porch. I was wondering if I could visit the house and see if the porch is still intact." "Of course," Patricia said. "Though I should mention, we've redone the porch several times. It's been rebuilt at least twice that I know of." Rebecca drove down to Natchez the following week. The Magnolia Inn was a columned Greek Revival mansion on a street lined with similar houses, all of them now bed and breakfasts or museums. Patricia met her at the door and gave her a tour. The interior was decorated in period style, with reproduction wallpaper and antique furniture arranged to suggest how the house might have looked in the 1850s. There was nothing about slavery, no mention of the 37 people who had been held captive here, just vague references to the servants and the original family. The front porch had been rebuilt completely, as Patricia had warned. Modern wood, painted white, with rocking chairs arranged for guests. But when Rebecca looked at the old photograph and then at the house itself, she could see how the perspective matched. This was the spot where that photograph had been taken, where Louisa Catherine had sat with her doll, and where Sarah had stood within the arc of her tether. "Do you have any documents about the enslaved people who lived here?" Rebecca asked. Patricia looked uncomfortable. "There might be some things in the storage room, old ledgers, bills of sale. I've never really gone through them carefully. It's not really the part of the history that guests want to hear about, you know?" "I would very much like to see them," Rebecca said. The storage room was in the basement, and it was full of boxes that had not been opened in decades. Rebecca spent the rest of the day going through plantation records, and what she found confirmed everything Marcus had told her. There were bills for ankle cuffs purchased from a blacksmith in Natchez with a note in the margin, for nursery use. There were letters from Margaret Winslow to her sister in Charleston, describing how she had solved the problem of Louisa's night wakings by ensuring that Sarah was always within reach day and night. And there, in a leather-bound journal kept by James Winslow himself, was an entry from 1859. Commissioned Matthews to photograph Louisa with her nursery girl, had to have Sarah cleaned up. For the occasion, remove the tether so as not to alarm future viewers. The result is quite charming. Louisa looks like a little angel. Rebecca photographed every page. She found one more thing before she left. In a box of estate documents from after the Civil War, there was a list of formerly enslaved people who had remained in the Natchez area after emancipation. Most had taken new last names, often the names of family members who had been sold away from them. One entry read, Sarah Freeman, age approximately 20, residing in the colored section near Cemetery Road, washerwoman. Sarah had survived. She had taken a surname that spoke to her freedom, and she had stayed in Natchez or returned to it after the war. Rebecca felt a spark of hope. If Sarah had stayed local, there might be descendants, there might be a family who remembered her, there might be a record in the black community's archives, the parallel histories that white institutions had so often ignored. She contacted the Natchez Afro-American Historical Society, a small organization run by local historians working to preserve black history in the city. The director, James Washington, invited her to their office in a converted church building on the north side of town. Sarah Freeman, James said, pulling out a set of binders filled with family trees and oral histories. We might have something. Freeman is a common surname here. A lot of formerly enslaved people took it after emancipation. They searched for 2 hours. Finally, James found an entry in a church membership roll from 1870. Sarah Freeman had joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Pine Street. The roll listed her age as approximately 22, which matched. There was a notation that she had married in 1872, taking the surname Johnson. After that, the trail went cold. But James made some phone calls, and by the end of the day, he had found something remarkable. There was a woman named Dorothy Johnson, age 83, who lived in Natchez and who had grown up hearing family stories about an ancestor named Sarah who had been enslaved at one of the big houses before the war. I can ask if she would be willing to talk to you, James said. But you need to understand, this is sensitive. A lot of families don't like to talk about the slavery period. There's trauma there. And there's also the question of what you're going to do with this information. If you're just using it to make white folks feel bad about their ancestors, that's not going to sit well. I want to tell Sarah's story, Rebecca said. I want people to understand what was done to her. But I also want to center her as a person, not just a victim. If there's a family who remembers her, who has kept her memory alive, that's part of the story too. James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll make the call. Dorothy Johnson agreed to meet with Rebecca at the church. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and careful manners. She brought a folder of family papers, including a few photographs from the early 20th century and some handwritten notes that her grandmother had made about family history. My grandmother used to tell me about Sarah, Dorothy said. She was my great-great-grandmother. Grandmother said Sarah never talked much about the time before freedom. She said it hurt too much to remember. But she did tell a few stories, and my grandmother wrote them down because she did not want them to be lost. She opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in faded handwriting. This is what my grandmother remembered. Sarah said she had been a nursery slave at one of the big houses in town. She said they kept her tied to the white baby so she could never get away. She said the rope around her ankles wore her skin raw, and the mistress would put salve on it sometimes, but would never take the rope off. Sarah said the white family thought they were being kind because they didn't beat her like they beat the field slaves. But she said being tied to that child was like being buried alive. She could not run. She could not hide. She could not even sleep without being woken up every time the baby cried. Dorothy looked up from the paper. Grandmother said Sarah never got over it. Even after freedom, even after she married and had children of her own, she could not stand to have anyone too close to her at night. She would wake up panicking, thinking she was still tied up. Rebecca felt tears burning in her eyes. She blinked them back and took a breath. I found a photograph, she said. It shows Sarah standing next to the white child. You can see the mark in the dust where the tether had been. They removed it just for the photograph. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Can I see it? Rebecca showed her the image on her laptop. Dorothy stared at it, her hand covering her mouth. That's her, she said finally. That's Sarah. My grandmother described her as being very dark-skinned, and you can see that even in the photograph. And the way she's standing, that's what grandmother described. She said Sarah always stood like she was braced against something pulling on her. They sat together in the church office, looking at the photograph. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the old pews and the wooden cross on the wall. Rebecca thought about how many prayers had been said in this building, how many people had come here seeking refuge and community and a place where their full humanity was recognized. "What are you going to do with this?" Dorothy asked. "I want to tell the story," Rebecca said. "I want people to know what happened to Sarah, but I also want to do it in a way that respects her and her family. I don't want this to be just another story about white guilt. I want it to be about Sarah's survival and about how we can learn to see the truth in these old photographs." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Then I want to help. I want people to know that Sarah lived through that horror, and she built a life afterward. She had 4 children. She worked as a washerwoman for 40 years. She helped found this church. She lived to be almost 70 years old. She was more than just what was done to her." They made a plan. Rebecca would present her findings to the Historical Archives Board and propose a new exhibition centered on the photograph. Dorothy would provide Sarah's story from the family's perspective. They would work together to make sure the exhibition honored Sarah's full life, not just her suffering. But when Rebecca returned to Jackson and presented her proposal to the Archives Board, she ran into resistance she had not anticipated. The board met in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the archive building. There were 8 people around the table, including the archives director, a man named Charles Montgomery, who had been in the position for 20 years. Rebecca had prepared a presentation with images of the photograph, copies of the documents she had found, and testimony from Marcus Chen and Dorothy Johnson. She explained the nursery tethering system. She showed how the photograph documented a practice that had been deliberately hidden from historical memory. She argued that reinterpreting this image was essential to the archive's mission of preserving and presenting accurate history. Charles Montgomery listened with his arms crossed. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and frowned. "This is certainly disturbing material," he said, "but I have concerns about how we would present this to the public. The Winslow family donated this collection to us with the understanding that we would honor their legacy. This interpretation, while possibly accurate, is quite inflammatory." "It's not inflammatory," Rebecca said, keeping her voice level. "It's the truth, and the Winslow legacy is not something that should be honored without context." "I'm not saying we should hide the truth," Montgomery said, "but we need to think about our donors and our community relationships. The Winslow family still has descendants in the area. They support this archive financially. If we create an exhibition that portrays their ancestors as monsters, we could lose that support." "I'm not calling anyone monsters," Rebecca said. "I'm saying that this photograph documents a specific practice that was part of the system of slavery. That's historical fact. We have the evidence right here." Another board member, a woman named Susan Fletcher who worked in fundraising, spoke up. "Can we maybe present this in a more balanced way? Acknowledge the practice, but also note that many slaveholding families thought they were providing care for enslaved children? Put it in the context of the time?" Rebecca felt her frustration rising. "The context of the time is that enslaved children were property. Sarah was tethered like an animal because she was not seen as fully human. There is no balanced way to present that. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now to soften it." The meeting went on for another hour. Some board members supported Rebecca's proposal, others worried about controversy and funding. In the end, they agreed to table the decision and form a committee to study the issue further. Rebecca left the meeting feeling exhausted and angry. She had expected some resistance, but the language of balance and context felt like euphemisms for continued erasure. How many more times would institutions prioritize donor relationships over historical truth? She called Dorothy Johnson that evening and explained what had happened. Dorothy was not surprised. "That's how it always goes," she said. "When we try to tell the truth about what happened, white folks worry about making other white folks uncomfortable. But you know what? Comfort is a privilege. Sarah did not get to be comfortable. She spent her childhood in bondage. The least we can do is be uncomfortable with that truth." "I agree," Rebecca said. "So what do we do?" "We tell the story anyway," Dorothy said. "We don't wait for permission. We go to the newspapers. We talk to journalists. We make sure this photograph and Sarah's story get out there, whether the archive board likes it or not." Rebecca knew Dorothy was right. She started making calls. She contacted a reporter at the Clarion Ledger who had written about racial justice issues. She reached out to colleagues at other institutions who had fought similar battles. She connected with a documentary filmmaker who was working on a series about hidden histories in the American South. Within 2 weeks, the story began to break. The newspaper ran a front-page article with the photograph. Newly discovered image reveals dark practice in Natchez Plantation home. The article included quotes from Marcus Chen, Dorothy Johnson, and Rebecca, along with analysis of the historical documents. The response was immediate and polarized. Some people were horrified and grateful to finally understand what the photograph really showed. Others accused Rebecca of pushing a political agenda, of reading too much into a simple image, of slandering a respected family. But something shifted. The Archives Board held an emergency meeting and decided, under public pressure, to move forward with the exhibition. They asked Rebecca to curate it, with Dorothy Johnson serving as a community advisor. The exhibition opened 6 months later. It was called Seen and Unseen, Reading Slavery and Antebellum Photographs. The photograph of Louisa Catherine and Sarah was the centerpiece, displayed on a large panel with detailed annotations pointing out the line in the dust, Sarah's worn ankles, her posture. Next to it was a video screen playing Dorothy Johnson's testimony about Sarah's life after emancipation. The exhibition also included the documents Rebecca had found, the bill for ankle cuffs, Margaret Winslow's letters, James Winslow's journal entry. But most importantly, it included Sarah's voice, as preserved in Dorothy's grandmother's notes. Visitors could read Sarah's own words about what it had been like to be tethered to a white child, unable to move freely, unable to claim her own childhood. The exhibition traveled, first to museums in Mississippi, then across the South, then to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Each venue added local stories, photographs from their own collections that, when re-examined closely, revealed similar patterns of hidden violence. Rebecca stood in the Washington exhibition on opening night and watched visitors move through the space. She saw people lean in close to study the photograph, saw them notice the line in the dust for the first time, saw the recognition dawn on their faces. She heard conversations, some quiet and reverent, others heated and uncomfortable. Dorothy Johnson was there too, having traveled from Natchez with her family. She stood in front of Sarah's photograph for a long time, her hand resting on the frame. "She's not invisible anymore," Dorothy said quietly. "They tried to hide what they did to her, but she's here now. She's seen." The exhibition did something else too. It created a model for how to read other photographs. Visitors began to look at all the old images in museums and textbooks with new eyes. They started to notice the children standing in corners, the women positioned just out of focus, the men whose expressions suggested something far more complex than the simple narratives these photographs were supposed to tell. Other researchers reached out to Rebecca with their own discoveries. A curator in Louisiana found a photograph with scuff marks on a nursery floor that matched Sarah's arc pattern. An archivist in South Carolina discovered letters describing similar tethering practices. A graduate student in Virginia found bills of sale for chains and restraints specifically sized for children. The pattern was clear. This was not an isolated practice. It was systemic, widespread, deliberately hidden. And it had been captured inadvertently in hundreds of photographs that had been sitting in archives and albums for generations, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what was really there. Rebecca returned to her work at the archive with a renewed sense of purpose. Every photograph she examined now, she looked for the details that did not quite fit the official narrative, the objects that should not be there, the expressions that revealed something the photographer had not intended to capture, the traces left behind by people who had been written out of history but who had left their mark anyway. She thought often about that line in the dust, about how close it had come to being overlooked entirely. If the photograph had been taken a few days later, after a rain, the mark would have been gone. If the photographer had positioned the subjects slightly differently, the line would not have been visible in the frame. If Rebecca had not looked closely, had not asked the right questions, had not connected with people like Marcus Chen and Dorothy Johnson and James Washington, the photograph would have continued to tell only one story. But now it told two. It showed what the Winslow family wanted the world to see, a charming domestic scene, evidence of their genteel lifestyle. And it showed what they could not quite hide, the truth about how that lifestyle was built and maintained, the violence that was always there, even when it was temporarily removed from view. The photograph became a teaching tool. Professors used it in their classes on visual literacy and historical interpretation. Journalists referenced it when writing about how institutions shape public memory. Activists pointed to it as evidence of why telling the full truth about slavery matters, why we cannot afford to sanitize or soften what really happened. And for Dorothy Johnson and her family, it became something more personal. It was proof that Sarah had existed, that her suffering had been real, that her survival and her strength mattered. It was a piece of family history that had almost been lost, but that was now preserved and honored in a way that centered Sarah's humanity rather than her oppression. Rebecca thought about all the other photographs still waiting to be examined. All the other stories hidden in plain sight. How many images in family albums and museum collections and history textbooks were really evidence of violence, of exploitation, of resistance that had been deliberately obscured. These photographs were not neutral. They were never just pictures. They were performances, staged by people with power to document their version of reality. They showed what enslavers wanted to be remembered, what they wanted their descendants to believe about them. But they could not quite erase everything. The truth had a way of leaving traces, marks in the dust, signs that something had been removed from the frame but not from the world. Looking closely at these images meant acknowledging that the respectable families whose portraits lined museum walls had built their wealth on captivity and violence. It meant understanding that the children who smiled prettily for the camera often had other children bound to them, tethered within arm's reach, denied freedom and childhood and the possibility of joy. It meant recognizing that every old photograph telling a story about the grace and gentility of the Old South was also, if you looked carefully, telling a story about who paid the price for that fantasy. The line in the dust was still there, visible in the photograph that now hung in museums across the country. It would always be there, a mark that could not be erased, a truth that could not be hidden anymore. And Rebecca hoped that every person who saw it would learn to look more carefully at all the other images they encountered, to ask what was just outside the frame, what had been removed before the camera clicked, whose story had been buried so that someone else's story could be told. Because Sarah's story was not an exception, it was the pattern. And once you learned to see that pattern, you could never look at these photographs the same way again.